I'm a virtual Mark Rowland this morning. In the 1970s, Pete Seeger was invited to sing in Barcelona, Spain. Francisco Franco's fascist government, the last of the dictatorships that started World War II, was still in power, but declining. A pro-democracy movement was gaining strength, and to prove it, they invited America's best-known freedom singer to Spain. More than 100,000 people were in the stadium, where rock bands had played all day, but the crowd had come for Seeger. As Pete prepared to go on, government officials handed him a list of songs he was not allowed to sing. Pete studied it mournfully, saying it looked an awful lot like his set list. But they insisted he must not sing any of those songs. Pete took the government's list of banned songs and strolled on stage. He held up the paper and said, "I've been told that I'm not allowed to sing these songs." He grinned at the crowd and said, "So I'll just play the chords. Maybe you know the words." They didn't say anything about you singing them. He strummed his banjo to one song after another, and they all sang. 100,000 defiant freedom singers breaking the law with Pete Seeger, filling the stadium with words that their government did not want them to hear, words they all knew and had sung together in secret circles for years. What could the government do? Arrest 100,000 singers? It had been beaten by a few banjo chords and the fame of a man whose songs were on the lips of the whole world.
There's no more natural fit for our church than to claim Pete Seeger as one of our patron saints. A couple of years ago, I bought matching t-shirts for what I like to call our emerging band that featured a picture of Pete's banjo with the added caption, "The right song at the right moment can change history." For both recording reasons and copyright laws, our internet audience rarely gets to hear what our musicians do here. But for those of us in Springfield, in the seated congregation, it's not my preaching or theological insights that created this community of faith. At best, I have simply been the partner to an amazing group of musicians who put their passionate words of a liberating and compassionate message that this church came into existence to prophetically proclaim, but they're the ones that really articulate it. When we have a distant listener who decides to make the religious Hajj to come and visit our church, they always come away saying, "Well, you know, I've always liked your preaching, but the music is even better." And I'm like, it's true. They do a better job than I do. In the case described in our wisdom lesson today, we see a solid historical example of how the saying on the t-shirt is literally true. Pete Seeger had the courage to go and perform in Spain in the 1970s when Franco's fascist government still held power. Government censors showed up at the concert, handed Seeger a list of his popular songs that they would not allow him to sing in Spain. And it would have been a kind of moral victory if Seeger had just decided to ignore the censors, forge ahead, walk out on stage, and start to sing his songs. But if he had, they probably would have interrupted the concert, arrested him, and he would have disappeared into a prison from which he might have mysteriously emerged only as a corpse. What he decided to do was so much more powerful that it sent a compelling message to the declining fascist government in Spain, and it did help to change history. He just started to play the chords of his songs on his famous banjo, and this stadium full of eager fans started to sing the songs themselves. So it wasn't that a heroic Pete Seeger went to liberate Spain in a single defiant concert. It was that the Spanish people had been listening to, singing, memorizing these protest songs for years. The ideas in the songs were already in their hearts. The ideas may have come to them from poets, I hope some preachers and priests, philosophers and revolutionaries, but it all found expression in popular songs. One of our former members used to rather publicly lament during class and after services, all you do is talk about these things, but we never do things. Well, of course we do things. We feed the homeless. We care for domestic violence victims. We resource the unsheltered. We provide food for the poor. We sometimes march, protest. We call our legislators. And sometimes we humiliate them in the opinion pages of the newspaper. But still, I understand the complaint. Mostly, we just talk. My hope is that I talk something like the way that Pete Seeger sang. I keep wanting to plant ideas in people's ears, reassuring them that they are not alone, encouraging them to be brave, so that when there are enough believers, when the conviction is strong enough, a fascist like Franco finds himself to be no longer in charge of people's hearts and minds. 2 weeks ago, I told the story of a young slave who ran away from the service of our first president of the United States and then spent the next 50 years of her life as a fugitive. I talked about slavery as America's original sin. But I had discussed this some months earlier with our musicians, uncertain whether we should call slavery America's original sin, or was the genocide of Native Americans really our original sin. Both historical horrors could be said to deserve that designation, though I think in terms of sequence of events, history might favor slavery for that title, but really, that's a contest nobody wants to win, right? But a part of my premise in that sermon was that Washington and the fugitive slave, only judge, is that there were people all around Washington who were very articulately advocating for the liberation of slaves. Washington was not just swept along by the white supremacy of the prevailing culture into being a slave owner. He made the decision to be a slave owner when people around him were emancipating their slaves. He was a participator. He participated in literally breeding and working slaves for his personal profit and for his personal comfort. I'm not saying that he didn't also do great things in his life. I'm just saying that he had a glaring moral flaw, that he had ample information and opportunity to have risen above. And today I want to say in a similar vein that that is also true of America's other original sin, the genocide of Native Americans. You know, there were about 90 million Native Americans in North America when white Europeans began to push to take control of the continent. There are only about 4 million today, and only 1/3 of them live on reservations in intentional Native American communities. As bad as the Holocaust in Europe was in the 1940s, and I understand that making a comparison like this is dubious, because it took place in a fairly short period of time, but there were about 6 million Jews and gypsies and homosexuals killed during the Holocaust, but over 80 million Native Americans over a century. Unbelievable numbers of deaths. You could look at any number of incidents of broken treaties and intentional spreading of disease among Indian populations, but I want to pull out one of the most egregious examples today, a massacre at Sand Creek that took place in November of 1864. While the Civil War was raging in the eastern states, gold had been discovered in the Colorado Rockies. And though this was Indian land belonging by treaty to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, troops were forcing the Native Americans back to make way for gold miners. There have been numerous skirmishes, but in November of that year, Colonel John Chivington, a former pastor, led his men to attack a village, killing all of the men, the women, and even the infants that they found there, scalping and dismembering their bodies. By the way, scalping was a technique of white Europeans that the Indians learned from us. We act like that was their idea, but it wasn't. That was what we did to them. But there were two officers under the command of Chivington, Captain Soule and Lieutenant Cramer, who ordered their men to refrain from the attack. They had confronted Chivington the night before the massacre began and pressed the case for not attacking this unprepared and largely disarmed community of families, and they did it with such ferocity that Chivington threatened to send them both back east in chains. But in the end, he agreed to not attack the Indian village. He was, of course, lying. The next morning, the forces broke out and slaughtered the entire village. After the massacre, the soldiers returned to Denver, displaying the scalps of the men, women, and children they had killed, expecting to be greeted as heroes. And initially they were. But Soule and Cramer reported the real events to Congress, sparking one of our nation's first congressional investigations. And that turned the massacre at Sand Creek into a national embarrassment. And so began the loss of appetite among Americans for the Indian Wars. Now, these were just two men, and they were grossly outnumbered by those who felt, as Chivington was known to have frequently said, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I've come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little." And when in the congressional hearings they asked him, "But why did you kill the babies?" he said, "Nits make lice." Chivington was relieved of duty. I don't know if he returned to preaching after that. Something tells me he may have. Soule and Cramer were a part of a culture that had dehumanized Indians, that thought that killing Indians was patriotic and even a holy endeavor, but somehow they had thought their way out of it. They rose above the prevailing culture and came to a higher place. And in so doing, they went to Congress and held up a mirror to the American people to let the nation see what we had become. But prejudice doesn't die overnight. A great society is not birthed in a single event, but it takes the leadership of a few prophets to show us what we can become. This is Spencer Rapone's West Point graduation photo. He is a combat veteran from Iraq and obviously a West Point educated officer. Last year, he was one of several soldiers that was dishonorably discharged from military service because he began to criticize their presence in Iraq. He read about how the military had used the death of the famous football player Pete Tillman to massage the story into a kind of fake propaganda to sell the war to the American people. Rapone was discharged for disparaging the military mission and advocating for a socialist revolution in America. He decided that our entire system of government had to be changed. Now, Rapone's reaction to his disappointment in finding out that his military leaders would actually lie to him, that they would engage in military brainwashing, may have been extreme. But I got to tell you, it wasn't quite as extreme as what Pat Tillman's brother, Kevin Tillman, said after Pat's death. Pat and Kevin had joined the Army together shortly after 9/11. It was a patriotic decision for them to defend their nation against attack from foreign terrorists. But their education in international affairs didn't begin in earnest until Pat was killed, not by enemy forces, but by friendly fire, just through sloppy conduct on the battlefield in Afghanistan in 2004. 2 years later, in 2006, after he had been dismissed from his military service, Kevin Tillman said these things in an essay that was published in honor of his slain brother. It's long. I'm not going to read all of it. I'm just going to read a few pieces of the essay, but you can find the whole thing on truthdig.com under the heading of After Pat's Birthday. Kevin writes, "Somehow we were sent to invade a nation because it was a direct threat to the American people or to the world, or harbored terrorists, or was involved in the September 11 attacks, or received weapon grades uranium from Niger, or had mobile weapons labs, or WMDs, or had a need to be liberated, or we needed to establish democracy there, or stop an insurgency, or stop a civil war that we created, that we can't call a civil war, even though it is, something like that. Somehow our elected officials were subverting international law and humanity by setting up secret prisons, secretly kidnapping people, secretly holding them indefinitely, secretly not charging them with anything, secretly torturing them. Somehow that overt policy of torture became the fault of a few bad apples in the military. Somehow the more soldiers that died, the more legitimate the invasion becomes. Somehow faking character, virtue, and strength is tolerated. Somehow profiting from tragedy and horror is tolerated. Somehow the death of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people is tolerated. Somehow subversion of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution is tolerated. Somehow suspension of habeas corpus is supposed to keep this country safe. Somehow torture is tolerated. Somehow lying is tolerated. Somehow reason is being discarded for faith, dogma, and nonsense. Somehow America has become a country that projects everything that it is not and condemns everything that it is. Somehow the most reasonable, trusted, and respected country in the world has become one of the most irrational, belligerent, feared, and distrusted countries in the world. Somehow being politically informed, diligent, and skeptical has been replaced by apathy through active ignorance. Somehow, the same incompetent, narcissistic, virtueless, vacuous, malicious criminals are still in charge of the country. Somehow this is tolerated. Somehow nobody is accountable for this. In a democracy, the policy of the leaders is the policy of the people. So don't be shocked when our grandkids bury much of this generation as traitors to the nation, to the world, and to humanity. Most likely they will come to know that somehow was nurtured by fear, insecurity, and indifference, leaving the country vulnerable to unchecked, unchallenged parasites. That essay is 19 years old now, and we still have troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq. I trust that I do not need to point out to you the moral connection between the hundreds of thousands of civilians we have killed in Afghanistan and Iraq and the massacre at Sand Creek 155 years ago. I appreciate that you may have learned a bit of history when I told the story of Oney Judge a couple of weeks ago. You may also have not known about the massacre at Sand Creek before today, but we don't come here for history lessons. We come here to hear the voices of people like Captain Soule and Lieutenant Cramer. We come to hear their voices in the music of Pete Seeger and in the memorial musings of Kevin Tillman. We want to stand in the breach of military propaganda and cleaned up public school history to offer a prophetic and honest voice to train the conscience of the next generation of decision makers. I don't know where Pat and Kevin Tillman went to church, but I'm pretty sure that their church let them down. They let them be sucked into the military propaganda machine, leaving them to learn the sorry truth only after they were uniformed and on the battlefield in Afghanistan. I just hope we never make that mistake again. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.